Today we're going to be looking at section 11.5, quadratic functions and their graphs. On example 1, the graph f of x equals x squared is done for you. And they're asking us to graph g of x, which is x squared plus 3 on the same graph. All that plus 3 does is move it up on the y-axis at this point, and then we simply make the graph. Example 2, the graph of f of x, again, f of x equals x squared is done for you. Graph g of x, which is x squared minus 1 on the same graph. Again, we're working with the y-axis, and it just moves it down 1, and we draw the graph. The graph f of x equals x squared, again, on this one is done for you. Graph g of x, the quantity x minus 2 squared on the same graph. Now you notice the change is that it is the squared on the x is not here, but the negative 2 is inside and the whole thing is squared. When you see something like this, we are actually moving on the x-axis. And oddly enough, even though it's minus 2, it moves to the right and it starts at positive 2. So again, they will always be the opposite sign. So if it's minus 2, you will go to a positive 2. If that had been plus 2, you would have gone to a minus 2. And all it does is shift that graph over. On example 4, the graph f of x equals x squared, again, is done for you. And they're asking us to graph g of x, excuse me, which is the quantity x plus 3 squared. Again, we have it in parentheses, so we are on the x-axis. Since it is a plus 3, we go to the minus 3. We know it's the opposite sign, and go ahead and draw our graph. The graph of f of x, again, is on the graph, and so it is x squared. Graph, now they've done two things. We have x minus 3, the quantity squared, and then we have a plus 1 outside of the parentheses. So we have two different shifts, but we know that when it's inside parentheses, we go to the opposite one. So we've moved over 3 on the x-axis. And that positive 1 outside, that goes back to moving on the y-axis. So we go up 1, and there's our point, 3, 1. And from there, we draw our graph. And there's the graph of g at x. In example 6, we have the graph f of x equals a negative x squared. And it shows how the negative sign flips the graph over the x-axis. The y equals 5x squared graph shows how the graph narrows in width with a larger x coefficient versus the smaller x coefficient, 0.1, which makes the graph wider. So we're looking at this. We have the wider graph, and then we have the narrow graph. And then we have y equals a negative x squared, which is simply flipped over the x-axis.